My name is Samantha Wilson, and I'm 32 years old. When I was 14, my father abandoned my 8-year-old sister Kelly at Chicago O'Hare Airport to teach her a lesson about disobedience. That single act of cruelty shattered our family and shaped the adults we would become. 2 decades later, I still remember the look of absolute terror in Kelly's eyes as security held her back while we boarded our flight without her. Before I tell you how my father's cruel lesson shaped my entire life, drop a comment sharing where you're watching from and subscribe if you've ever felt abandoned by someone who should have protected you. My story might help you understand you're not alone in healing from childhood trauma. Growing up in the Wilson household meant walking on eggshells. My father, Marcus, ran our family like a military unit rather than a loving home. Every minor infraction warranted what he called corrective action, his euphemism for punishments designed to build character. My mother, Heather, was his perfect counterpart, conflict avoidant to a fault and unwilling to challenge his methods, no matter how extreme. "Your father knows best," she would whisper while dabbing tears from my face after particularly harsh punishments. "He's just preparing you for the real world." The real world, as I would later learn, was nowhere near as cruel as our family home. Between my parents stood Kelly and me. At 14, I was old enough to recognize the dysfunction but too young to escape it. Kelly, at 8, was just a normal, energetic child who had the misfortune of being born to a father who viewed childhood itself as something to be corrected rather than cherished. Our bond was forged in these shared hardships. When Kelly was just 5, I began sneaking into her room after particularly tense family dinners to reassure her. "It's not your fault," I would whisper, holding her small hand in the darkness. "Dad's just in one of his moods." I became her protector, her translator in a home where children's feelings were invalidated and natural behaviors were treated as deliberate provocations. Dad's teaching moments were legendary in their cruelty, though he always framed them as valuable life lessons. When I was 12, I forgot to bring my science project to school. Instead of simply letting me face the natural consequence of a lower grade, Dad made me sleep in the garage for a night to learn responsibility. Mom brought me extra blankets when he wasn't looking, but never challenged his decision. Kelly once spilled juice on our cream-colored living room carpet when she was 7. Dad made her scrub the entire room with a toothbrush, refusing to let her eat dinner until she finished. I snuck her crackers and cheese while Mom pretended not to notice. These lessons were cruel but predictable. We adapted, learning to anticipate his triggers and minimize the fallout. But nothing prepared us for what happened at the airport. It was supposed to be a simple family trip to visit our grandparents in Florida during spring break. Kelly had been looking forward to it for months, drawing pictures of beaches and palm trees that Mom dutifully hung on the refrigerator. But the week before our departure, Kelly went through a phase of talking back, normal 8-year-old boundary testing that Dad interpreted as a personal affront. "You need to get that attitude under control before our trip," he warned her 3 days before our flight. "I won't tolerate disrespect on vacation." Kelly, being 8, didn't fully comprehend the threat. She continued to assert herself in small ways, sighing dramatically when asked to clean her room, questioning why she had to finish her vegetables when Dad often left his. The night before our trip, I found her packing her suitcase, carefully arranging her favorite stuffed animals alongside her summer clothes. "Are you excited about seeing the ocean?" I asked, sitting on the edge of her bed. "So excited," she beamed. "Grandma said she's going to teach me to collect seashells, and Grandpa promised to build a giant sand castle with me." I helped her finish packing, all while a knot of anxiety tightened in my stomach. Dad had been unusually quiet at dinner, a sure sign he was simmering about something. I made a mental note to stay close to Kelly during our journey, hoping we could make it to Grandma Rachel's house without incident. I had no idea that by this time tomorrow, our family would be forever changed. The morning of our flight dawned bright and clear, one of those perfect spring days that promised new beginnings. Kelly bounded out of bed at 6 a.m., already dressed in her traveling outfit, a blue sundress with white sandals she'd selected specifically for the trip. "Is it time to go to Florida?" she asked, her voice still raspy from sleep. Dad looked up from his coffee, his expression unreadable. Not if you don't eat your breakfast and get your suitcase by the door in the next 15 minutes. It was an unnecessarily harsh response to a child's excitement, but typical for him. Kelly's smile faltered, but she climbed onto her chair and began eating the cereal Mom had prepared. I can't wait to see Grandma Rachel, Kelly whispered to me, careful to keep her voice down. Dad overheard anyway. If you spent half as much energy following instructions as you do talking, you might become a responsible person someday. The drive to Chicago O'Hare was tense. Mom attempted small talk about the weather forecast in Florida, while Dad responded in clipped, one-word answers. Kelly fidgeted in her seat, unable to contain her excitement despite the obvious tension. I reached over and squeezed her hand, silently urging her to stay calm. Stop squirming, Dad snapped when we hit traffic about a mile from the airport. You're old enough to sit still for 5 minutes. But my foot fell asleep, Kelly protested, rubbing her leg. That's it, Dad muttered, gripping the steering wheel tighter. One more word out of you, and there will be consequences. The threat hung in the air for the remainder of the drive. By the time we pulled into the airport parking structure, Mom's face was pale, and I was mentally calculating how to keep Kelly quiet and compliant through check-in and security. The airport was bustling with spring break travelers. Long lines snaked around check-in counters, and harried parents corralled children and luggage. We joined the queue for our airline, Dad impatiently checking his watch every few minutes. Stand still, he hissed when Kelly began hopping from one foot to the other. I need to use the bathroom, she whispered. You should have gone before we left home, he replied, refusing to make eye contact with her. You'll have to wait. 20 minutes later, we reached the front of the line. While Mom handed over our identification and Dad spoke with the airline representative, Kelly tugged at my sleeve. Sam, I really need to go, she pleaded, her face pinched with discomfort. Dad, I began carefully, Kelly needs to use the restroom. It's right over there. I can take her quickly. He shot me a warning look. She can wait 5 more minutes until we're done here. But Kelly, in the way of all desperate children, couldn't wait. She shifted from foot to foot, then suddenly bolted toward the nearest gift shop, probably intending to find a bathroom inside. Kelly, I called, preparing to go after her, but Dad's hand clamped down on my arm. Let her go, he said, his voice eerily calm. The airline representative handed over our boarding passes, and Dad collected them with a tight smile. Thank you. Shouldn't we wait for your daughter? The woman asked, gesturing toward where Kelly had disappeared into the shop. She'll learn a lesson today, Dad replied. Let's go. Mom's face went even paler. Marcus, we can't just. We can and we will, he cut her off. She needs to learn that actions have consequences. Dad, this is insane, I protested, looking frantically toward the shop where Kelly had gone. She's 8 years old. Which is old enough to start learning about responsibility, he countered, grabbing his carry-on bag. Let's go. Security is this way. Mom hesitated, looking between Dad and the direction Kelly had gone. Marcus, please. She'll be terrified. Good, he replied coldly. Then maybe she'll remember this the next time she decides to disobey. I planted my feet, refusing to move. I'm not leaving without Kelly. Dad's face darkened as he grabbed my arm. You don't make the decisions in this family. As he began physically dragging me toward security, I saw Kelly emerge from the gift shop, looking around in confusion when she didn't immediately spot us. Her eyes widened when she saw Dad pulling me away. Wait, she called, starting to run toward us. A security guard noticed the commotion and stepped forward, placing himself between Kelly and our family. Is everything all right here? He asked, looking between Kelly and my father. We're teaching our daughter a lesson about wandering off in airports, Dad stated matter-of-factly. She'll be fine. The airline can put her on the next flight. The guard's face registered shock. Sir, you can't abandon a minor in an airport. I'm not abandoning her, Dad insisted. I'm teaching her that actions have consequences. She knows our phone numbers and where we're staying in Florida. Kelly began to cry, reaching for Mom. I'm sorry. I just had to go potty. Please don't leave me. The raw terror in her voice shredded my heart. I struggled against Dad's grip, but he was too strong. Dad, please, I begged, tears streaming down my face. This is crazy. She's just a little kid. Mom stood frozen, tears sliding silently down her cheeks as she stared at Kelly. "Ma'am," the security guard addressed my mother, "do you consent to leaving your child behind?" Before Mom could answer, Dad stepped in. "My wife and I are united on this parenting decision." Mom said nothing, effectively giving her consent through silence. The guard looked deeply troubled, but seemed uncertain about his authority to intervene in what Dad was framing as a parenting choice. "I'll need to call airport security and child services." "Do what you need to do," Dad replied dismissively, continuing to pull me towards security while Mom followed like a ghost. The last image of Kelly that seared into my memory was her small form being held back by the security guard as she reached for us, her face contorted in confusion and terror, screaming, "Mommy! Sammy," over and over as we walked away. I fought and screamed all the way to the security checkpoint, begging my parents to stop this madness, but Dad's grip was iron, and Mom's will had crumbled entirely. Other travelers stared in horror, but no one intervened. As we passed through security and toward our gate, I hated my father with an intensity one had never known possible. But I hated my mother even more for her cowardice. The walk to the gate felt like a death march. My arm throbbed where Dad had gripped it, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional agony of knowing we were boarding a plane while Kelly remained behind, terrified and alone. "You can't do this," I repeated, my voice hoarse from screaming. "She's just a little kid." Dad's expression remained impassive. "She's old enough to learn about consequences." When we reached the gate, I made one final, desperate attempt to reason with my mother. "Mom, please. You have to go back for her." Mom's eyes were vacant, her face tear-stained, but resolute in her submission to Dad's will. "Your father knows best, Samantha. Kelly will be fine. She's 8 years old." I shouted, causing several nearby passengers to turn and stare. "How will she be fine alone in an airport?" "Lower your voice," Dad commanded. "You're making a scene." "I'll make more than a scene if you don't go back for Kelly right now," I threatened, my teenage bravado bolstered by desperation. Dad leaned close, his voice a dangerous whisper. "One more word out of you, and you'll be taught the same lesson when we land. Is that what you want?" The threat silenced me temporarily, not because I feared for myself, but because I realized if I pushed too far, I might not be able to help Kelly later. I needed to stay strategic. When our row was called for boarding, I made one last attempt to break away, planning to run back to security. Dad anticipated this and kept a firm grip on my arm as he handed the gate agent our boarding passes. "Is everything okay?" the agent asked, noticing my tears and obvious distress. "Family disagreement," Dad replied smoothly. "Teenagers, you know how it is." The agent looked doubtful but waved us through, and moments later, we were walking down the jetway. Once seated on the plane, the full horror of our situation became impossible to ignore. I was sandwiched between Dad at the window and Mom in the aisle seat, effectively trapped. As the final boarding announcements were made, I began to hyperventilate. "She's going to think we abandoned her," I gasped between breaths. "She's going to be so scared." Mom reached for my hand, but I yanked it away. "Don't touch me. You left her there. You just left her." A flight attendant paused at our row, concern evident on her face. "Is everything all right?" Before my parents could respond, I blurted out, "My parents left my 8-year-old sister alone at the security checkpoint to teach her a lesson. You need to let me off this plane right now." The flight attendant's eyes widened. "Sir, ma'am, is this true?" "Our daughter is being dramatic," Dad replied calmly. "Our younger daughter wandered off, and airport security is helping her. The airline has been notified, and arrangements are being made for her to follow on a later flight." It was a masterful lie, implying Kelly had wandered off of her own accord and that proper arrangements had been made, neither of which was true. "That's not what happened," I protested. "They deliberately left her behind. She's all alone and terrified." The flight attendant looked uncertain, glancing between me and my father. "Sir, if your minor child is unaccompanied at the airport, the matter is being handled by airport security and airline staff," Dad interrupted smoothly. "We've provided all necessary contact information." Other passengers were now openly staring, some with obvious concern, others with judgment. "She's 8 years old," I said to no one and everyone. 8. And they just walked away from her. The flight attendant hesitated, then leaned closer. "I need to inform the captain about this situation." As she walked away, Dad turned to me, his voice low and threatening. "You've just made this much worse for everyone, Samantha. Including Kelly." The plane began to push back from the gate before the flight attendant returned. She leaned down to speak quietly to my mother. "The captain has been informed, and the airline has confirmed they're in contact with airport security regarding your younger daughter. There's nothing we can do once we've left the gate, but I want you to know that child welfare authorities will likely be involved when you land." Mom nodded mutely, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. The 3-hour flight to Florida was the longest of my life. I curled away from both parents, facing the seat in front of me, and cried silently. Around me, other passengers whispered and cast troubled glances our way. A middle-aged woman across the aisle caught my eye and mouthed, "Are you okay?" I shook my head slightly, and she frowned, looking like she wanted to help but wasn't sure how. Dad spent the flight reading his newspaper, as if nothing unusual had happened. Mom alternated between silent tears and anxious fidgeting with her wedding ring. Neither spoke to me, and I refused to acknowledge them. When we landed in Florida, Dad turned on his cell phone immediately. It rang almost instantly. "Yes, this is Marcus Wilson," he answered calmly. He listened for a moment, then replied, "Yes, our daughter Kelly wandered off at the Chicago airport. We've been quite worried." The blatant lie made me want to scream. "Mum," he continued. "Yes, she tends to be impulsive. We're relieved she's safe." "No, that won't be necessary. Tell her we'll see her when we return from our trip in a week." "No, we won't be returning to Chicago to collect her. This is an important lesson about staying with family in public places." My jaw dropped in disbelief. Not only was he refusing to acknowledge what he'd done, but he was also planning to leave Kelly in Chicago for our entire week-long vacation. "Dad," I hissed, "you can't be serious." He held up a hand to silence me. "Yes, she has grandparents in Chicago who can collect her. Thank you for your assistance." He hung up and pocketed his phone. "Kelly is fine. Airport security has her, and they're contacting children's services. I've told them her grandmother will collect her." "Which grandmother?" Mom asked, finally finding her voice. "My mother's in Seattle, and your mother's expecting us in Tampa." "They don't need to know that," Dad replied dismissively. "By the time they sort it out, Kelly will have learned her lesson." I stared at him in absolute horror. "You're leaving Kelly with strangers for a week while we go on vacation? What is wrong with you?" "Lower your voice," he warned. "Kelly made a choice. Now she deals with the consequences." As we deplaned, I felt completely hollowed out. My little sister was alone and terrified in Chicago, and I was powerless to help her. Mom moved like a zombie beside me, while Dad collected our luggage with the casual efficiency of a man without a care in the world. Grandma Rachel was waiting for us at baggage claim, her face lighting up when she spotted us. Her smile faltered as she did a quick head count. "Where's Kelly?" she asked, looking behind us as if my sister might suddenly appear. Dad began his practiced explanation, but I interrupted. "He abandoned her at O'Hare," I stated flatly. "She went to the bathroom, and he decided to teach her a lesson by leaving her there. She's with airport security now, and he's refusing to go back for her." Grandma Rachel's face transformed from confusion to horror to fury in the space of seconds. For the first time in my life, I saw someone stand up to my father without hesitation. "You did what?" she demanded, her voice ringing through the terminal. Grandpa Joe's grip on the steering wheel was so tight his knuckles had turned white as he drove us from the airport to their Florida beach house. The car vibrated with tension. In the back seat, I sat as far from Dad as possible while Mom stared vacantly out the window. Grandma Rachel had spent 20 minutes on her phone in the airport terminal, her voice rising and falling as she spoke with Chicago police, airport security, and finally Child Protective Services. When she finished, she turned to her son, my father, with a look of such profound disappointment that even he seemed momentarily chastened. "They're placing Kelly in emergency foster care tonight," she informed us, her voice tight with controlled rage. Since neither of her parents is willing to return immediately to collect their abandoned child. "She wasn't abandoned," Dad insisted. "She's learning a valuable." "Don't you dare finish that sentence," Grandma interrupted. "What you've done isn't parenting. It's abuse, Marcus. Plain and simple." For the first time, I saw uncertainty flicker across my father's face. At the beach house, Grandma Rachel immediately began making arrangements for our return flight the next day. Dad protested, but she silenced him with one look. "Either you fly back tomorrow and face what you've done, or Joe and I will go ourselves and start the process of seeking custody of both girls," she stated firmly. "Your choice, Marcus." That night, I lay awake in the guest bedroom, staring at the ceiling and wondering what Kelly was doing at that exact moment. Was she scared? Crying? Had anyone comforted her? The thought of her alone with strangers made my stomach churn with anxiety. Around midnight, I heard soft sobbing from the living room. Creeping down the hallway, I found Mom curled on the couch, shoulders shaking as she tried to muffle her cries. "How could we leave her there?" she whispered when she noticed me. "What kind of mother am I?" I had no comfort to offer her. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "I really don't know." The return flight the next day was a study in strained silence. Dad stared stonily ahead, refusing to acknowledge the gravity of what he'd done. Mom seemed to have aged a decade overnight, her face lined with worry and shame. I alternated between anxiety about Kelly and rage at my parents. When we landed in Chicago, 2 uniformed police officers and a woman in a business suit were waiting at our gate. "Marcus and Heather Wilson?" one officer asked, though it was clearly not a question. Dad nodded stiffly. "I'm Detective Pearson, and this is Officer Ramirez," the man continued. "And this is Ms. Jensen from the Department of Children and Family Services. We need you to come with us regarding the abandonment of your minor daughter, Kelly Wilson, at this airport yesterday." "It wasn't abandonment," Dad began, but the detective cut him off. "Sir, multiple witnesses have given statements, and security footage confirms that you deliberately left an 8-year-old child behind despite her visible distress and pleased to stay with her family. We can have this conversation here, or we can have it at the station. Your choice." For once, my father had no smooth reply. Ms. Jensen, the social worker, approached me. "You must be Samantha. Kelly's been asking for you." My heart leaped. "Is she okay? Where is she?" "She's physically fine, but obviously very upset and confused. She's with a temporary foster family who specializes in emergency placements. We'll need to interview you separately about what happened." The next few hours passed in a blur of sterile rooms, recorded statements, and clinical questions. I told the truth without embellishment, describing my father's teaching moments and my mother's chronic failure to intervene. I spoke of Kelly's terror as we walked away, of my own desperate attempts to resist, of the sick feeling in my stomach as the plane took off. After my interview, Ms. Jensen led me to a small room where Kelly was waiting with another social worker. The moment she saw me, she launched herself into my arms, her small body shaking with sobs. "You came back," she whispered against my neck. "I thought you weren't coming back." "I would never leave you," I promised fiercely. "Never ever." Kelly's account of the hours after we left was heartbreaking. She had been taken to a security office, where officers tried to contact our parents. When Dad refused to return for her, she was eventually placed with an emergency foster family. "They were nice," Kelly said of her foster parents, "but I was so scared, Sammy. I didn't know if I would ever see you again." I held her tighter, fury and protectiveness warring within me. When we were finally permitted to leave the airport, it wasn't to go home. Instead, we were transported to our maternal aunt's apartment while our parents attended an emergency hearing with Child Protective Services. Aunt Beth, Mom's younger sister, welcomed us with open arms and barely concealed anger at her sister and brother-in-law. "I always knew Marcus was controlling," she muttered as she made up the sofa bed for us, "but this crosses every line." "And Heather just went along with it." I nodded tiredly, keeping my voice low so Kelly wouldn't overhear from the bathroom. "She always does." The next few weeks were chaotic. Kelly and I remained with Aunt Beth while our parents were required to attend parenting classes and undergo psychological evaluations. Our home was subject to unannounced visits from social workers, and both of us began weekly sessions with a therapist specializing in childhood trauma. Kelly's psychological wounds manifested immediately. She developed severe separation anxiety, panicking if I left her sight even briefly. Nightmares plagued her sleep, and she regressed in several areas, including occasionally wetting the bed, something she hadn't done in years. My wounds were less visible but equally profound. I became hypervigilant, constantly scanning for threats to Kelly's well-being. My grades suffered as I focused solely on protecting my sister. Trust, already in short supply, became nearly impossible. At school, whispers followed us as news of the airport incident spread. Teachers watched us with concerned eyes, and school counselors called me in for additional support. Kelly's second-grade teacher, Ms. Parker, became an unexpected ally, creating a safe space in her classroom where Kelly could decompress when anxiety overwhelmed her. At home, our parents were allowed supervised visitation 3 times a week. Dad maintained that he had done nothing wrong, framing the entire situation as an overreaction by the nanny state to reasonable parental discipline. I was teaching her responsibility, he insisted during one particularly tense visit. Now look at the mess we're in because everyone's so soft on kids these days. Mom, at least, showed remorse, though it felt too little, too late. I should have stopped him, she admitted during a therapy session. I've never been able to stand up to Marcus. That's not an excuse, I replied coldly. Kelly needed you to protect her, and you didn't. Our family was fracturing along fault lines that had always existed, but had now been exposed by the earthquake of the airport incident. Extended family took sides, with Dad's relatives generally defending his right to parent as he sees fit, while Mom's family rallied around Kelly and me. Neighbors who had once praised my father's strict parenting now avoided eye contact in the grocery store. Dad's colleagues at work maintained a polite distance, and invitations to neighborhood functions quietly ceased. Throughout it all, I documented every concerning interaction, every dismissive comment from my father, every instance of my mother's failure to advocate for us. The notebook I kept became my insurance policy against returning to the status quo. I'm going to keep us safe, I promised Kelly each night as I tucked her into bed in Aunt Beth's spare room. I won't let anyone hurt you again. What I didn't tell her was how terrified I was that I might not be able to keep that promise. 3 months after the airport incident, Kelly and I were still living with Aunt Beth. The small 2-bedroom apartment had become our sanctuary, a place where raised voices and arbitrary punishments didn't exist. Aunt Beth, with her gentle approach and consistent boundaries, showed us what family life could be like without walking on eggshells. Child Protective Services had established a reunification plan for our family, requiring both parents to complete parenting classes, attend individual therapy, and demonstrate improved understanding of child development and appropriate discipline. Dad went through the motions with barely concealed contempt, while Mom seemed genuinely committed to change. The court-mandated family therapy sessions were exercises in tension and restraint. Dad would sit stiffly in his chair, offering textbook responses that satisfied the letter but not the spirit of the requirements. I understand now that my approach was developmentally inappropriate, he would say, parroting phrases from his parenting classes without genuine reflection. Children need guidance, not punishment. Meanwhile, his behavior at supervised visitations told a different story. He would bring small gifts for Kelly, bribes, essentially, then spend the time subtly undermining her confidence and reminding her of past failures. You're doing better with listening, he told her once, his voice honey-sweet but laced with poison. Remember how your poor listening skills got us into this whole mess? The social worker supervising the visit immediately intervened, but the damage was done. Kelly's progress regressed for days afterward. As the months wore on, Dad's frustration at the ongoing supervision and his loss of control manifested in increasingly concerning ways. He began using financial control as a weapon, refusing to provide adequate child support while simultaneously making extravagant purchases for himself. When challenged by the court, he claimed business losses had reduced his income, a claim later proven false. He attempted to isolate us further by spreading his narrative among family friends, painting himself as the victim of overzealous government interference and Kelly and me as manipulated children. Samantha has always been overdramatic. I overheard him telling our former neighbor on the phone. She's poisoning Kelly against us, and these social workers are enabling her teenage rebellion. Most disturbing were his attempts to drive a wedge between Kelly and me. During supervised visits, he would whisper to Kelly when he thought no one could hear, "Samantha is the reason we can't be together as a family. She's the one telling lies about me." I documented every incident, sharing them with our caseworker and therapists. The evidence was building, but the process was agonizingly slow. Throughout this difficult period, unexpected allies emerged. My guidance counselor, Jessica, became an invaluable support, helping me navigate the complexities of the legal system while maintaining my grades and mental health. "You're carrying an adult-sized burden," she told me during one of our weekly meetings. "But you don't have to carry it alone." Kelly's therapist, Dr. Martinez, specialized in childhood trauma and worked miracles in helping my sister process her abandonment. Through play therapy and age-appropriate interventions, Kelly slowly began to rebuild her sense of security. "Will I ever stop being scared all the time?" Kelly asked me one night as I brushed her hair before bed. "Yes," I promised, hoping it was true. "Your brain is just trying to protect you right now because of what happened. But Dr. Martinez is helping it realize you're safe with Aunt Beth and me." The school year ended and summer brought new challenges. Without the structure and safety of school, Kelly's anxiety intensified. Dad's visitation rights expanded to include supervised outings, which triggered panic attacks for Kelly. "I don't want to go," she sobbed before their first scheduled trip to the park. "What if he leaves me there?" No amount of reassurance from me or the social workers could convince her that history wouldn't repeat itself. The outing was canceled, infuriating Dad. Our saving grace came in the form of Grandma Rachel, who flew in from Florida and rented an apartment nearby to support us. Unlike Mom, whose backbone seemed to dissolve in Dad's presence, Grandma Rachel was unafraid to stand her ground. During her first supervised visit with all of us, she confronted Dad directly about his behavior. "What you did wasn't parenting, Marcus," she stated firmly. "It was cruel, and it was designed to cause fear, not teach responsibility. Until you can acknowledge that fundamental truth, these girls will never be safe with you." Dad's face darkened. "You've always undermined my parenting, Mother. This situation is as much your fault as anyone's." Grandma Rachel didn't flinch. "I raised you better than this, and that's a fact I'll have to live with. But these girls deserve a father who sees them as people to nurture, not objects to control." Her presence changed the dynamic significantly. With Grandma Rachel's financial support, we were less vulnerable to Dad's economic manipulation. She attended every court hearing and meeting with social services, providing a counter-narrative to Dad's version of events. Most importantly, she offered Kelly and me a vision of what family support should look like. She attended Kelly's dance recital, helped me prepare for the SAT, and created new traditions that began to heal our wounded understanding of family. As summer turned to fall, the temporary custody arrangement was extended. Dad's frustration reached new heights when he realized reunification wasn't imminent. His mask of compliance began to slip more frequently, especially during a particularly tense family therapy session in October. "This has gone on long enough," he exploded after the therapist suggested extending the supervised visitation period. "I've jumped through every hoop, attended every ridiculous class, and for what? To be treated like a criminal for disciplining my own child." "It wasn't discipline," I interjected, my voice surprisingly steady. "It was abandonment, and it was cruel." Dad turned to me, his eyes cold. "You've always encouraged Kelly's disobedience. This situation is as much your fault as hers." Mom, who had been making small steps toward asserting herself, surprisingly spoke up. "That's not fair, Marcus." Samantha was trying to protect her sister. "As should we have." "So you're taking her side now?" Dad demanded, his voice rising. "After everything I've done for this family." The therapist attempted to de-escalate, but Dad stood abruptly, knocking his chair backward. "I'm done with this farce," he declared, pointing at me. "When you turn 18, don't expect a dime for college. You've made your choice." As he stormed out, leaving Mom sitting in stunned silence, I felt a strange sense of clarity. The threat, meant to terrify me into compliance, instead confirmed what I'd always suspected. Dad's love was conditional, a tool of control rather than a bond of affection. That evening, Grandma Rachel found me on the apartment balcony, staring at the sunset. "He showed his true colors today," she said quietly, joining me at the railing. I nodded, surprised to find I was dry-eyed. "He's always been this way. The only difference is now other people can see it too." She placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. "I want you to know that your college fund is secure. I've been contributing to it since you were born, and it's in a trust he can't touch." The kindness nearly undid me. "Thank you," I whispered. "You and Kelly deserve a future free from his control," she continued. "And I intend to make sure you get it." 2 days later, the breaking point came. Dad arrived for his supervised visit in a foul mood, having just received notice that the court was extending the supervision requirement for another 6 months. When Kelly hesitated to hug him, his calm facade finally shattered completely. "This is ridiculous," he snapped, gesturing angrily toward the social worker. "My own daughter is afraid of me because of all the nonsense you people have put in her head." Kelly shrank back, and I stepped between them instinctively. "She's allowed to have feelings, Dad." "Stay out of this, Samantha," he warned, his voice dropping to a dangerous register I recognized from childhood. "This is between me and Kelly." "Mr. Wilson," the social worker intervened, "please lower your voice and step back." Instead, Dad took a step toward me, his finger jabbing the air inches from my face. "You've poisoned her against me. If you think I'll ever forgive that, you're sadly mistaken." I held my ground, though my heart raced. "I didn't have to poison anyone. Your actions did that all by themselves." What happened next occurred so quickly it seemed like a blur. Dad's face contorted with rage, his hand raised, and for a horrifying moment, I thought he might strike me. Mom screamed, Kelly burst into tears, and the social worker moved to protect us. Dad caught himself at the last second, but the damage was done. His mask had slipped completely, revealing the threat of violence that had always simmered beneath the surface. The social worker immediately terminated the visit and called her supervisor. Mom, in a moment of clarity I hadn't thought her capable of, pulled out her phone. "What are you doing?" Dad demanded. "Calling the police," she replied, her voice shaking but determined. "This ends now, Marcus." The Jefferson County Family Court was housed in a sterile government building with squeaky linoleum floors and fluorescent lights that cast everyone in an unflattering pallor. 6 months after Dad's explosive outburst during the supervised visit, we gathered for the custody hearing that would determine Kelly's and my future. I sat beside Grandma Rachel in the front row, my black skirt and blue blouse carefully chosen to project maturity and stability. At 16, I was still technically a minor, but the court had agreed to hear my testimony given the circumstances. Kelly, now 9, would speak to the judge privately in chambers, spared the ordeal of confronting our father in open court. Dad entered with his attorney, a sharp-featured man whose expensive suit seemed designed to intimidate. Mom followed separately with her own lawyer, a decision that had enraged Dad but signaled her growing independence. The physical separation of my parents in the courtroom symbolized the permanent fracture in our family. When Kelly entered with the court-appointed guardian ad litem, her small face solemn but composed, my heart swelled with pride and pain. No 9-year-old should have to testify about family trauma, yet here we were, the consequences of Dad's lesson still rippling outward more than a year later. The proceedings began with opening statements, legal language washing over us in waves of best interests and parental rights and traumatic impact. I squeezed Grandma Rachel's hand, drawing strength from her steady presence. Kelly's testimony came first, conducted privately but recorded and read into the record by the judge. Her words, filtered through the court's formal language, still carried the raw pain of abandonment. The minor child states that she remains fearful of being left alone in public places, the judge read. She reports nightmares about being lost and unable to find her family. When asked about her relationship with her father, the minor child expressed concern that he might leave me somewhere again if I make him mad. Dad's face remained impassive, but I noticed a muscle jumping in his jaw, his tell when he was suppressing anger. When my turn came, I approached the witness stand with leaden legs, but determined resolve. After being sworn in, I faced the courtroom, avoiding Dad's gaze. "Samantha, my parents' lawyer began. Could you please describe what happened at Chicago O'Hare Airport on March 15th of last year?" I recounted the events as clearly as possible: Kelly's need for the bathroom, Dad's decision to leave her behind as a lesson, my futile resistance, the plane taking off with Kelly left behind. I described her terror and confusion, the callousness with which Dad had planned to leave her in Chicago for our entire vacation, and the pattern of controlling behavior that had preceded the airport incident. "And has your father ever acknowledged the harm caused by his actions?" the lawyer asked. "No," I replied firmly. "He maintains he was teaching a valuable lesson about responsibility and consequences. He blames Kelly for wandering off, me for overreacting, and the authorities for interfering with his parenting." During cross-examination, Dad's attorney tried to paint me as a rebellious teenager with a grudge against parental authority. "Isn't it true that you've had disciplinary issues at school?" he asked, referencing a detention I'd received for skipping class on a day I'd left to help Kelly during a panic attack, though he conveniently omitted this context. "I received one detention last year," I acknowledged. "It was for leaving school without permission when the counselor called to say Kelly was having a severe panic attack and asking for me." The attorney shifted tactics. "And isn't it true that teenagers often misinterpret parental discipline as unfair or harsh when it's actually appropriate boundary setting?" "Abandoning an 8-year-old child in an airport isn't boundary setting," I replied evenly. "It's neglect and emotional abuse." When it was Dad's turn to testify, he presented a carefully constructed narrative of a concerned father whose disciplinary methods had been misunderstood and blown out of proportion. Kelly had been exhibiting defiant behavior for weeks, he testified, his voice measured and reasonable. At the airport, she deliberately wandered off despite clear instructions to stay with the family. "I made a split-second decision to teach her about safety and responsibility." "And do you stand by that decision?" his attorney asked. Dad paused, clearly coached to show contrition. "I recognize now that it wasn't the most effective approach. If I could do it over, I would handle it differently." It was a masterful non-apology, acknowledging the strategy was ineffective without admitting it was wrong or harmful. During cross-examination, however, the facade began to crack. "Mr. Wilson, did you tell airport security that your daughter would be collected by her grandmother, knowing this was untrue?" Dad shifted uncomfortably. "I might have mentioned her grandmother as a potential contact." "And isn't it true that you initially planned to leave Kelly behind for the duration of your week-long vacation?" I was upset and speaking in the heat of the moment. "Yet phone records show you made that statement to authorities twice, hours apart." Was that still the heat of the moment? As questioning continued, Dad's carefully constructed persona gradually unraveled. When pressed about his threatening behavior during supervised visits, he became defensive and combative, his true nature emerging despite his best efforts to suppress it. "These visits were designed to make me fail," he snapped. "Having strangers watch your every move with your own children, it's unnatural and provocative." Mom's testimony was the most surprising. After months of therapy and separation from Dad's influence, she spoke with a clarity and conviction I'd never witnessed before. "Marcus has always believed in harsh consequences," she testified. "I told myself it was just his parenting style and that he had our children's best interests at heart. I was wrong. What happened at the airport wasn't an isolated incident or a momentary lapse in judgment. It was the culmination of years of controlling and intimidating behavior." My heart lifted at her words, hope blooming that perhaps she had finally found the courage to stand with her children rather than her husband. That hope was short-lived. During a court recess, I overheard Dad and Mom speaking in a corner of the hallway, their voices low but intense. "You're doing well," he told her. "Keep following the script, and we'll get through this together." "Marcus, I meant what I said in there," Mom replied. Things have to change. Of course they will, he assured her, his voice taking on the silky quality I recognized as manipulation. Once we get the girls home, everything will go back to normal. Better than normal. I slipped away before they noticed me, a cold not forming in my stomach. When court resumed, Mom's demeanor had subtly shifted. During her continued testimony, she began to backtrack on key points, suggesting that her previous statements might have been colored by emotion and that Dad's parenting, while strict, had been mischaracterized by authorities. I believe Marcus deserves another chance, she concluded, avoiding my gaze across the courtroom. He's learned from this experience, and our family should be reunited. The betrayal was so profound it left me breathless. After everything that had happened, after all the progress she had seemingly made, Mom was choosing Dad over Kelly's and my safety once again. Grandma Rachel's testimony provided a counterpoint to this betrayal. She spoke powerfully about witnessing the aftermath of the airport incident, the psychological damage to both Kelly and me, and Dad's continued refusal to acknowledge the harm he'd caused. My son views his children as possessions to be controlled rather than individuals to be nurtured, she stated, her voice steady despite the pain of speaking against her own child. Until that fundamental perspective changes, Kelly and Samantha will never be safe in his care. When asked about her willingness to continue providing support, Grandma Rachel didn't hesitate. I'm fully prepared to continue housing and supporting both girls for as long as necessary, she affirmed. Their well-being is my primary concern. The final blow came during Dad's closing statement to the judge, when he was given an opportunity to speak directly about his desire for reunification. Your Honor, this past year has been challenging for our family, he began, his voice calibrated to project sincerity. While I maintain that my intentions were to teach an important life lesson, I recognize that my methods were misinterpreted and have caused distress. The careful wording, misinterpreted, not wrong, caused distress, not traumatized, revealed his true perspective. However, he continued, I believe it's time for our family to heal together. Samantha has unfortunately developed a rebellious attitude that has influenced Kelly and complicated our family dynamics. With proper counseling and clear boundaries, I'm confident we can restore the stable, disciplined household that served us well before this incident. The message was clear, nothing was his fault, nothing would change, and if given custody again, he would focus on correcting my rebellion rather than his own behavior. As he spoke, I caught Mom's eye across the courtroom. She quickly looked away, unable to meet my gaze, her cowardice a familiar disappointment. The judge's decision came 3 days later. Based on the testimony, psychological evaluations, and recommendations from social services, she ruled that Kelly and I would remain in Grandma Rachel's custody, with Mom granted supervised visitation rights that could expand over time if she demonstrated independent judgment and prioritization of her children's well-being. Dad was limited to monthly supervised visits with no overnight privileges, contingent on his completion of an intensive parenting program specifically addressing emotional abuse and appropriate boundaries. The supervision requirement would be reassessed after 1 year. Outside the courtroom, Dad approached me while his attorney distracted the social worker. You'll regret this for the rest of your life, he said quietly, his public mask momentarily dropped to reveal the threat beneath. You're no longer my daughter. I met his gaze steadily. I know, I replied. And that's the first good news I've had in a long time. As he stormed away, I felt a strange mixture of grief and liberation. The father I had desperately wanted, one who loved unconditionally and protected reliably, had never existed. Accepting that truth was painful but necessary for healing to begin. The family I had known was gone forever, shattered beyond repair by an act of cruelty disguised as a lesson. In its place would have to be something new, something Kelly and I would help build with Grandma Rachel, brick by painful brick. Life with Grandma Rachel began tentatively, like stepping onto thin ice, testing each footfall before committing our full weight. The small 3-bedroom house she rented near our schools became a laboratory for normal family life, something neither Kelly nor I had experienced before. What are the rules here? Kelly asked on our first night, her voice small and uncertain as she perched on the edge of her new bed. Grandma Rachel sat beside her, keeping a careful distance that acknowledged Kelly's lingering anxiety about adult proximity. Well, the most important rule is that everyone deserves to feel safe and respected. The rest are mostly practical: homework before electronics, help with household chores, communicate if you're going to be late. Does that seem reasonable? Kelly nodded slowly, waiting for the catch, the hidden trap door that would spring open beneath these seemingly fair expectations. When none appeared, she gradually began to relax into this new reality. Establishing routines became our first priority. Regular meal times, consistent bedtimes, predictable schedules all created a framework of security that Kelly desperately needed. I watched as my sister cautiously surrendered her hypervigilance, no longer scanning every room for potential threats or hoarding snacks in her backpack in case meals were withheld as punishment. My own healing proved more complex. At 16, I had spent years as Kelly's protector, developing an identity built around keeping her safe. With that role less desperately needed, I struggled to redefine myself. "You're allowed to be a teenager, you know," Grandma Rachel told me one evening, finding me checking the locks for the third time before bed. "Kelly is safe here. So are you." "I know," I replied automatically, though the knowledge hadn't yet penetrated to the level of belief. "I just need to make sure." When you've been in survival mode for years, it takes time for your brain to accept that the danger has passed, she said. "Be patient with yourself." Patience became our mantra as we navigated the aftermath of trauma. Kelly's nightmares continued, though their frequency gradually decreased. My anxiety manifested differently: in perfectionism at school, in relationship difficulties with peers, in a deep-seated fear of abandonment that made normal teenage social dynamics excruciating. The court-mandated therapy continued, providing essential tools for our recovery. Dr. Martinez helped Kelly process her abandonment through play therapy and age-appropriate interventions. My therapist, Dr. Chin, specialized in adolescent trauma and guided me through the complex process of establishing healthy boundaries while releasing inappropriate responsibilities. "You've been parentified for too long," Dr. Chin explained during one session. "It's appropriate for you to care deeply about Kelly's well-being, but your own development matters too." This concept, that my needs deserved consideration alongside Kelly's, was revolutionary and discomfiting. I had defined myself as Kelly's protector for so long that prioritizing my own growth felt almost selfish. School provided both challenges and opportunities for healing. Kelly's teachers were informed of her situation and created safety plans for anxiety attacks. My guidance counselor arranged a modified schedule that allowed me to check on Kelly during the school day when needed, easing my constant worry about her welfare. Friends became complicated territory. Few could understand the dynamics of our family situation, and I found myself withdrawing from social circles rather than navigating the exhausting process of explanation. Kelly, paradoxically, found connection easier, her third-grade classmates accepting her occasional panic attacks with the matter-of-fact resilience of children. "Madison says her parents are divorced, and she has 2 houses," Kelly informed me one afternoon as I walked her home from school. "She says it's normal for families to change." "Madison sounds pretty smart," I replied, squeezing her hand. "She says I can come to her birthday party next month," Kelly continued, a note of uncertainty entering her voice. "Do you think I could go?" The question contained multitudes. Was it safe to be away from family? Would she be abandoned again? Was joy permitted after trauma? The fact that she was asking at all represented immense progress. "Absolutely," I assured her. "We'll get her a great present." Mom's supervised visitations occurred weekly, awkward affairs that improved marginally over time as she continued her own therapy. Without Dad's influence, she slowly began to rediscover her voice, though years of submission had left deep grooves in her personality that resisted change. "I'm sorry I failed you both," she said during one visit, her eyes downcast. "I should have protected you." "Yes, you should have," I agreed, not softening the truth for her comfort. "But you can make different choices now." Kelly, more forgiving by nature, accepted Mom's tentative affection more readily than I could, though she remained wary of being alone with her, a boundary Mom painfully respected. Dad's monthly supervised visits were exercises in tension and manipulation. He adhered to the letter of the court's requirements while subverting their spirit at every opportunity, using his limited time to subtly undermine our confidence and plant seeds of guilt. "Your mother misses you terribly," he told Kelly during one visit, glancing sideways at the supervisor. "She cries herself to sleep in your empty bedroom." These visits often resulted in behavioral regression for Kelly and renewed anxiety for me. After 6 months, Kelly began refusing to attend them. A decision supported by her therapist and eventually formalized by the court. I continued to meet with Dad, partly to shield Kelly from his manipulation and partly from a stubborn hope that he might eventually acknowledge the harm he had caused. That hope diminished with each encounter, replaced by a growing acceptance that some people are incapable of the self-reflection necessary for genuine change. Grandma Rachel's cancer diagnosis came during my junior year of high school, adding a new dimension of uncertainty to our gradually stabilizing lives. The prognosis was guardedly optimistic, stage 2 breast cancer with good treatment options, but the possibility of losing our anchor terrified us both. "I'm not going anywhere without a fight," she assured us after breaking the news. "But we should talk about contingency plans, just to be safe." Those contingency plans included the sobering reality that at 18, I would become Kelly's legal guardian if Grandma Rachel couldn't continue in that role. The prospect was simultaneously daunting and affirming, a recognition of both the unfair burden placed on me and the strength I had demonstrated in caring for my sister. Grandma Rachel's illness had an unexpected effect on Mom, catalyzing her halting progress toward genuine independence. She stepped up during Rachel's chemotherapy treatments, providing reliable childcare and practical support that gradually rebuilt fractured trust. While our relationship remained complicated, I began to see glimpses of the mother she might have been without Dad's domineering presence. Dad, conversely, used Grandma Rachel's illness as leverage, suggesting through his attorney that the unstable living situation warranted reconsideration of the custody arrangement. The transparent attempt to exploit her vulnerability for his benefit severed my last lingering attachment to him. When the court decisively rejected his petition, I felt only relief. My final 2 years of high school passed in a blur of college applications, therapy sessions, and gradual healing. Kelly, now in 5th grade, began to thrive academically and socially, her resilience blossoming in the consistent safety Grandma Rachel provided. My own progress came in smaller increments, but by senior year, I had developed genuine friendships with a small circle of understanding peers and even cautiously began dating. "Do you think you'll ever trust people again?" my friend Jasmine asked one night during a rare sleepover at her house, my first night away from Kelly in years. I considered the question seriously. "I think I'm learning to trust differently," I finally replied. "Not blindly or completely, but carefully and with better boundaries." College decisions brought new challenges. I had been accepted to several universities, including my dream school across the country, but the thought of leaving Kelly created almost physical pain. "You should go," Kelly insisted when she found me staring at the acceptance letter. "I'll be okay with Grandma Rachel." "But what if," I began, unable to finish the sentence. "What if Grandma gets sick again?" Kelly finished for me, suddenly sounding much older than 11. "Then Mom will help, or Aunt Beth. I have a whole support system now, Sammy. You helped build it for me." Grandma Rachel offered similar encouragement, though with characteristic practicality. "Samantha, I've set up a trust fund for both of you. If anything happens to me, it will cover Kelly's needs and your education. You've put your life on hold long enough." The decision to attend university 3,000 miles away was the hardest and healthiest choice I had ever made. It represented both faith in Kelly's growing stability and acknowledgement of my own need for identity beyond Kelly's protector. The night before I left for college, Kelly crawled into my bed like she used to during thunderstorms. "I'm going to miss you so much," she whispered. "But I'm also really proud of you." "I'm proud of us both," I replied, holding her close. "We survived something that could have broken us, and instead, we got stronger. Like those Japanese bowls," Kelly said. "The ones they fix with gold." Kintsugi, I supplied, impressed by her reference. Exactly like that. We have some pretty golden cracks, but they make us more beautiful, not less. As I packed the last of my belongings the next morning, I found a small package tucked into my suitcase, a framed photograph of Kelly and me at the beach, our faces sun-kissed and genuinely happy, with a note in my sister's careful handwriting. Thank you for never leaving me behind. Now go find your own path. I've got this. Standing in the golden October sunshine outside the county courthouse, I watched Kelly emerge through the heavy wooden doors, her face breaking into a smile when she spotted me. At 24, she had grown into a poised young woman whose quiet confidence belied the trauma of her childhood. The anxious 8-year-old abandoned at O'Hare Airport was now a college senior majoring in social work with a focus on child welfare policy. How did it go? I asked, hugging her tightly. The committee loved my proposal, she replied, her eyes bright with purpose. They're recommending the Kelly Wilson Protocol be adopted statewide for airport and transportation security responses to potential child abandonment cases. Pride swelled in my chest. That's incredible, Kel. They said what happened to me shouldn't have been possible, she continued as we walked toward my car. With this protocol, it won't happen to anyone else. Airport staff will be specifically trained to recognize abandonment versus temporary separation, and clear procedures will trigger immediate protective responses. This moment, Kelly transforming her childhood trauma into protection for other vulnerable children, represented everything we had worked toward in the 16 years since that terrible day in Chicago. My own journey had taken a parallel path. After earning my doctorate in clinical psychology, I now specialized in treating children and adolescents affected by family trauma. My practice focused particularly on siblings, recognizing the unique dynamics that develop when children must protect each other from parental harm. Kelly slid into the passenger seat and buckled her seatbelt, a habit so ingrained neither of us remarked on it, though we both recognized it stemmed from her lingering need for security rituals. Grandma Rachel would have been so proud, I said as we pulled away from the courthouse. She is proud, Kelly corrected gently. I feel her with me every day. Grandma Rachel had passed away 3 years earlier, her cancer returning with devastating swiftness after 7 years in remission. Her death had been peaceful, surrounded by the family she had helped rebuild from the wreckage of Dad's cruelty. Her legacy lived on in both practical ways, the trust fund that had financed our education, and intangible ones, the blueprint she provided for loving family relationships based on respect rather than fear. Are you nervous about dinner tonight? Kelly asked, changing the subject. A little, I admitted. It's been 6 months since we last saw Mom. Our relationship with our mother had evolved into something neither close nor entirely distant, a careful détente built on her genuine remorse and our cautious forgiveness. After divorcing Dad following Grandma Rachel's initial cancer diagnosis, Mom had slowly reconstructed her life and identity. She attended therapy faithfully, built a career in bookkeeping, and eventually remarried a kind, soft-spoken man named Alan who treated her with the respect Dad never had. She's doing well with her recovery program, Kelly offered. 15 months sober now. Mom's alcoholism, a coping mechanism that had begun during the airport aftermath, had nearly destroyed her second chance at happiness. Her commitment to sobriety represented another step in her ongoing journey toward accountability. I'm glad, I replied sincerely. One day at a time, right? Dad remained a peripheral figure in our lives, his presence marked more by absence than contact. The supervised visits had eventually ceased altogether when I turned 18 and Kelly, then 12, continued to refuse to see him. My own sporadic attempts to maintain some connection had ended after a particularly vicious confrontation following Grandma Rachel's funeral. She poisoned you both against me, he had accused, cornering me in the church vestibule. Everything that happened was her fault. His inability to acknowledge reality, even at his own mother's funeral, had finally extinguished my lingering hope for reconciliation. I had walked away that day without responding, a silence more definitive than any words. According to Mom, Dad had remarried and moved to Arizona, where he had another family, a thought that occasionally kept me awake at night, wondering about half-siblings potentially subjected to the same lessons we had endured. Dinner with Mom and Alan took place at a quiet restaurant near their home. The conversation flowed more easily than in earlier years, touching on Kelly's advocacy work, my practice, Alan's woodworking hobby. Mom, sober and present in a way she rarely had been during our childhood, listened attentively to our lives. "I've been thinking about the airport a lot lately," she said during dessert, her voice tentative. With Kelly's protocol being considered for implementation. Kelly and I exchanged glances, the familiar tension returning to our shoulders. "I want you both to know that not a day goes by that I don't regret my inaction," Mom continued, her eyes fixed on her untouched cheesecake. "I failed you both so completely, and nothing I do can ever change that fact." "Mom," Kelly began, but Mom shook her head. "Please, let me finish. I've been working on this in therapy." She took a deep breath. "I was a coward. I chose my fear of Marcus over my duty to protect you. There's no excuse for that choice, and I don't ask for forgiveness. I just want you to know that I understand the magnitude of my failure, and I live with that knowledge every day." The raw honesty of her statement, free from excuses or self-pity, felt like a watershed moment in our complicated relationship. "Thank you for saying that," I replied after a moment. "It matters that you understand." Kelly reached across the table and briefly touched Mom's hand, a small gesture that would have been impossible years earlier. The evening ended with tentative plans for a weekend visit, a step toward building a relationship based on present choices rather than past wounds. In my Seattle apartment later that week, I sat at my desk reviewing patient files when a notification from my email pinged. The sender's name, Marcus Wilson, sent an electric jolt through my body. My father hadn't attempted contact in over 3 years. The message was brief. "I saw Kelly's name in the news regarding some airport protocol. Still looking for attention, I see. Some lessons need to be learned regardless of what society thinks." Dad. Even after all these years, his words had the power to trigger an immediate physical response, quickened heartbeat, shallow breathing, the old familiar knot in my stomach. But unlike the frightened teenager I had once been, I now possessed tools to manage these reactions. I closed the laptop without responding, practiced deep breathing exercises, and called my partner, Michael, who listened without judgment as I processed the emotions Dad's message had triggered. "Are you going to tell Kelly?" Michael asked when I had calmed. "No," I decided. "There's nothing constructive that would come from it. Dad is still incapable of acknowledging reality, and Kelly doesn't need that toxicity in her life." The decision to shield Kelly not from truth but from unnecessary pain represented my evolved understanding of protection, not controlling or hiding information, as Dad had done, but making thoughtful choices that respected her autonomy while acknowledging ongoing vulnerabilities. Michael's steady presence in my life was another measure of healing. Our relationship, now in its 3rd year, had developed with a deliberateness that friends sometimes found amusing, but that provided essential security for me. Trust, once shattered, could be rebuilt, but the architecture required careful planning and solid foundations. "Do you think you'll ever respond to him?" Michael asked. "I don't know," I answered honestly. Part of me wants to tell him exactly how his lesson impacted our lives. But another part recognizes that he's incapable of hearing it, and engaging would only reopen wounds that have taken years to heal. This capacity to hold complexity, to acknowledge both the lingering pain of childhood trauma and the possibility of a fulfilling adult life, marked my own journey toward wholeness. 2 weeks later, I stood before a room full of psychology students at the university where I occasionally guest lectured, sharing professional insights about sibling relationships in traumatic family systems. The bonds formed between siblings in dysfunctional families often become lifelines, I explained. When parents fail to provide security, children naturally turn to each other, creating protective systems that can be both adaptive in the moment and challenging to renegotiate in adulthood. A student raised her hand. "How do you help adults who were parentified as children establish healthier relationships without feeling like they're abandoning their siblings?" The question resonated deeply with my own experience. It begins with understanding that genuine protection doesn't mean sacrificing your own development. True caregiving creates independence, not dependency. The goal isn't to sever protective bonds, but to transform them into connections that support mutual growth rather than freezing both people in trauma-defined roles. After the lecture, I drove to the airport to pick up Kelly, who was flying in for the weekend. As I waited by baggage claim, I remembered another airport 16 years earlier and marveled at how a place that had once been the site of profound trauma could now simply be a point of happy reunion. When Kelly appeared, rolling her carry-on behind her, her face lit up at the sight of me. We embraced, two survivors who had refused to be defined by one cruel moment in our shared history. I got an email from the State Transportation Board, she said excitedly as we walked to the parking garage. They're officially implementing the protocol next month. They want me to speak at the announcement. That's amazing, I replied, feeling the full circle moment. You're literally changing how the world works, Kel. We are, she corrected. I couldn't have done any of this without you. That evening, sitting on my balcony overlooking Puget Sound, Kelly and I talked about our ongoing journey, the challenges of building healthy relationships, the occasional triggering moments that still caught us by surprise, the complex grief of losing family connections while gaining personal freedom. Do you think we'll ever completely heal? Kelly asked, watching the sunset paint the water gold and crimson. I considered the question carefully. I think healing isn't a destination but a direction, I finally replied. We'll always carry the impact of what happened, but we get to choose what we build with that experience. I like that, she said softly. Building something new instead of just trying to fix what was broken. As darkness fell over the water, I thought about all the people watching this video who might recognize their own experiences in our story, the abandoned children, the parentified siblings, the adults still carrying the weight of family trauma. You know, Kelly, I said, what happened at the airport wasn't the end of our story, but the beginning of a difficult journey toward becoming the people we were meant to be, despite, not because of, what our father did. Kelly nodded, reaching for my hand. And we're still writing the rest. Have our experiences with family trauma shaped your own healing journey? Share your story in the comments below. If this resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share. Your support helps others find community and healing. Remember that your past doesn't define your future, and sometimes the family we choose becomes our greatest strength. Thank you for witnessing our story, and may your own path lead to the peace and connection you deserve.